What a nice one. Look at that.
He's going to give Zigzag a run first. Again, he came a little more and then stopped, did one of these, and he just sucked it right up. And I mean, if I had had a cameraman, this would have been awesome. Yeah. Yep. Here's a hunting tracking scenario that happened a few years ago on a pretty good sized buck in Maine. And it's kind of interesting the way this went down. It's kind of a textbook thing. It might be some really good pointers for you when it comes to tracking. And this is kind of a neat scenario. We were driving down a long dead-end road, about a 5-mile long dead-end road, and we came across 3 deer that crossed the road. 2 of them are medium-sized tracks, and then 1 great big one. So the big one looks like a trackable deer, looks like a good-sized buck, so I get out on the track right here. Meanwhile, I send the truck up to the rest of the end of the road to check for more tracks, to see if these deer come back down across the road, or if other deer go across and go up. It's important to do thorough road work and check the whole thing and make sure that I'm not getting out on a dead loop and wasting my time. The truck runs down the end of the road, lets me know everything's cool, and I start up these tracks. The 2 medium-sized deer are both moving along at a pretty good pace. Kind of jumping, trotting. They slow down, then go 7,500 yards, and then start back in running a little bit, and they're working their way up through. They make their way up through the woods at a fairly steady rate, and then they turn up on top of a ridge. Now as they get up on top of the ridge, which is about a half a mile distance, I've gone about a half a mile, it's kind of the horizon in front of me. They've worked their way up through some cuts, and then the bigger one is on top in a lot of places. As he's coming up through, I can see his track on top, so I know that he's probably in the back. I try and keep track of them as I'm going and see if he walks on top of everything, and then I know he's in the rear. It's kind of important to know the progression of what's happening in front of you, and there was quite a few places where he stepped on top of both tracks, so I knew that he was in the rear. As they got to the top of the ridge, and I've shrunk this down so we can see it a little bit better, one of the deer makes a quick turn off a skid trail and jumps into some trees. The other medium-sized deer is now bounding and hopping pretty good pace and goes running and jumping right by that. It missed the turn that the first deer made and kept going, came out here, skidded to a stop, turned around and came back. This intersection right here is a very important thing. And the reason that's so important is that what's happened here is I've learned the sex of one of the smaller deer. It goes out here, one of them slows down, turns, and walks and goes into the bushes. I would assume it was a doe. The other deer that's about the same size comes hopping and running and jumping, and jumps and runs right by where this deer turned into the bushes real suddenly, and it figures out that it's missed the corner, and it comes running and hopping and jumping back and turns in. Meanwhile, our big buck, the one in the back, Mr. T, he's coming along on the top. And he steps on both of those and steps on top of all the other tracks in the intersection, and he's going at a lot slower pace. It would make sense for a big buck to take his time. He's not in a big hurry, and he's coming up through, taking up the rear of this little choo-choo train of breeding activity. And he turns in the corner and continues on. What I've just learned is that I have a doe, a small buck, and a bigger buck. I've now figured out what the sex is of this other deer. A doe running, trying to keep up, spinning around and coming back, could possibly be a fawn, but more than likely, it's probably a smaller buck. And it turns out that it was about a 5-pointer with about a 12 or 14-inch spread. Behind it was Mr. T, an 8-pointer, and he had a weight of like 225, but he was taking his time and walking along. As the deer get to this intersection, and now I've changed their sex, and they continue down the ridge, and I'll put in a red for the smaller buck, and now he starts after her, and all the deer are moving up down the ridge with Mr. T in the back here. He's walking on top, and I'm still following. I started about 8 o'clock in the morning. I've gone about a half a mile. I've walked at a pretty good pace because the deer were going pretty fast. So I went along pretty fast. As it got up here and the doe slowed down and turned into the bushes more, then I slowed down. As soon as the deer's pace slows down, you want to slow down. Now I'm looking, and Mr. T, he's right on top of the other deer's tracks. The biggest buck is on top. And they're going quite a distance from below where the road was. We've probably gone 3/4 of a mile, starting to go a mile. A doe has a pretty small home range, and if she's in the middle of the day and she's being chased around, she's apt to go someplace where she won't run into people. She'll go a certain distance, but odds are good she'll either circle back or she'll turn around and come back on her tracks. With them dogging her so much, I was hoping that they'd come back on their tracks. And sure enough, the deer came out, she did a donut, and came right back on her tracks, bringing the 2 bucks with her. They ran right into me because I was taking my time looking for the deer. They went down, turned around, came back to me. The doe jumped off, the smaller buck. I managed to let him get by me. And then I snort wheezed at Mr. T, and he came right over to me, threat walking me. He walked right up to me in the brush, and I shot him. Some of the biggest lessons to take away from this are track the biggest tracks you can find. You know, if you're going to spend the time and energy, go after the big ones. The speed of the deer moving through the woods will help tell you how fast to go. If the deer are on the highway and they're moving right along, move right along. They're going to gain a lot of distance in a hurry. When the deer take a sudden turn of some kind or the pace changes real quickly, now it's time for you to slow down. Doesn't mean you ever stop looking. You always keep your head up all the time. I'm always scanning for deer all the time. I'm looking, and the more they're running, the farther ahead I'm looking. But that doesn't mean they don't run up and come around a corner and stop. So you got to look all the time. But track the biggest bucks you can. Also follow the deer and figure out their attitude, their pace. Whenever there's an intersection and things change, whenever there's a pause or things change, you want to notice that and you follow. I'm always asking myself, what's in the deer's mind? What's its attitude? And also, too, you want to be standing on top of tracks all the time. I don't care what kind of tracks they are. A lot of times there'll be a moose out here. The deer will run right down the moose tracks. You want to be on tracks. Another important point. And don't give up. And if you have to go a half mile or a mile, most of the woods aren't more than a mile across. Piece of cake to catch up to them, and it's worth a try for sure. And I started about 8:30, and the deer was dead at about 11:02, so it worked out good. And because it was like a choo-choo train, I'm going along, and she turned around and came back, they ran right back into me. And if you're in the right spot and they come running right to you, nothing beats that.